Some souls seek the wilderness to escape their ghosts, but the wild has its own plans, and sometimes it sends a storm to bring two lost souls together. Montana Territory, 1884. An icy rain mixed with wet snow lashed the slopes of the Bitterroot Mountains. Elias Cole, once a tracker for the Army and now a man seeking solitude, pulled the collar of his worn coat tighter. He urged his bay horse through the blinding sheets of water. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, tearing at the pines that clung to the rocky terrain. This was the kind of weather that kept sensible folk by their fires, but Elias was checking his trap lines, a ritual that anchored his lonely days. Suddenly his horse shrieked with fear, its hooves sliding in the thick mud, nearly unseating him. He fought to control the panicked animal, his eyes scanning the trail ahead. There, by a fallen pine, lay a shape that was undeniably human. Elias dismounted, his boots sinking into the wet earth. He approached with the cautious tread of a man who knew the wilderness held more dangers than just storms. It was a woman. Her simple dress was soaked through, and strands of pale hair were plastered to her face. As he knelt, she flinched violently, her eyes wide not with simple fear, but with the cornered desperation of a hunted animal. "Do not touch me," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread against the roar of the storm. Her body was trembling uncontrollably from the biting cold. Elias kept his distance, his hands held open and away from his body. "I will not harm you," he said, his voice low and steady, a stark contrast to the storm's fury. He looked at her drenched clothing and blue-tinged lips. "But you will freeze if you stay out here. The cold will take you before morning." He spoke with a simple, undeniable logic. "My cabin is not far. There is warmth and shelter." He did not command or demand, but stated a fact. Her survival depended on trusting a stranger, a gamble that was written plainly in her terrified eyes. She gave no answer, her gaze darting around as if looking for an escape that did not exist. The fight seemed to drain out of her, replaced by a shuddering exhaustion. With slow, deliberate movements, Elias shrugged off his heavy duster. He gently wrapped it around her shoulders, then carefully lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than a child. He carried her to his horse, settling her in the saddle before mounting behind her. The ride to his cabin was a slow battle against the wind and mud. The silent, trembling woman pressed against his chest, a fragile weight of unspoken tragedy. The fire in the stone hearth crackled, casting a warm, dancing light across the single room of the small cabin. The woman, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, sat on a stool by the flames, sipping hot broth from a tin cup. The color was slowly returning to her cheeks. For a long time, the only sounds were the fire and the wind raging outside. Elias moved quietly, giving her space, respecting the silence that she seemed to need as much as the warmth. He sat across the room, cleaning his rifle, his presence a steady, non-threatening weight in the small space. Finally she spoke, her voice still hoarse. "My name is Leah Carter." She looked into the flames as if the words were pulled from there. She began to tell her story, the sentences broken and hesitant at first, then flowing with a rush of grief and anger. Her husband had not simply died. He had been a farmer, a good man who refused to sell his land to a cattle baron who wanted the creek that ran through it. He had been found at the bottom of a ravine, his death ruled an accident by a town that feared the powerful man who had wanted him gone. The man's name was Malachi Blackwood. After her husband's death, Blackwood had moved swiftly. He produced a document in court, claiming her husband had signed the land over to settle a debt. The judge, a man known to be in Blackwood's pocket, declared her marriage certificate a forgery and ordered her off the property. She was left with nothing. "He owns the law, the town, everything," she said, her hands tightening around the cup. "I ran. I just kept walking until the storm came." She had been fleeing not just poverty, but the certainty that Blackwood would not want a witness to his crimes left alive for long. Elias listened without interruption, his hands stilling on the rifle. He had heard the name Blackwood before, spoken in hushed, fearful tones in the few times he had gone to town for supplies. He saw the truth in her story, in the raw pain etched on her face. This was not just a victim. This was a woman who had been systematically broken by a man who believed himself a king. "Blackwood is known for his cruelty," Elias said quietly, his voice a low rumble. "But his reach ends at these mountains. Here, in this cabin, you are safe." Morning arrived with a piercing silence. The storm had passed, leaving the world draped in a clean, thin blanket of early snow. The air was crisp and cold. Over a breakfast of cornbread and salted bacon, Leah looked out the small window at the pristine landscape. A fragile peace had settled between them, born of shared shelter and unspoken understanding. Her gaze drifted back to Elias. "Why do you live here?" she asked softly. "So far from everyone." The question was simple, but it carried the weight of her own newfound isolation, a search for a common thread in their separate sorrows. Elias did not answer immediately. He stared into his coffee cup, his face a mask of old grief. "I had a wife," he began, his voice low and rough with disuse, "and a little girl. We had a small homestead not far from Redemption." He paused, the memory of physical pain. "The smallpox came through 5 winters back. It took them both within a week." He looked up, and his eyes were hollow. "I could not stand the sight of the town after that. The pitying looks. Every face was a reminder. So I came here. The silence helps." As he spoke, a movement on the distant ridge caught his eye. A rider. A lone figure on a dark horse, stark against the white snow. Elias fell silent, his body instantly tensing. Every instinct from his years as a tracker flared to life. He rose smoothly from his chair, his hand moving to the Colt revolver hanging from a peg on the wall. The rider paused, seeming to survey the small cabin and the thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. It was too far to make out details, but the intent felt sharp, like the point of a knife. The distant rider lingered for a long moment, a dark omen in the bright morning. Then, as deliberately as he had appeared, he turned his horse and vanished back over the ridge. Elias did not relax his posture. He knew that terrain. The man was not a lost traveler. He was searching. "That was one of Blackwood's men," Elias stated, his voice flat and hard. He looked at Leah, his expression grim. The hope of safety that had bloomed in the small cabin began to wither under the cold light of day. "They are looking for you." A day later, a different kind of visitor arrived. Gus, an old trapper with a face like a weathered map and eyes that missed nothing, appeared at the tree line leading his pack mule. He was the only person whose presence Elias tolerated without complaint. They had shared trails and dangers in years long past. Gus stomped the snow from his boots on the porch. "Figured you would be running low on coffee," he grunted, handing a small sack to Elias. His sharp eyes flickered to Leah, who stood nervously by the hearth. He took in the situation with a single, knowing glance but said nothing. As they sat by the fire, Gus brought news from the town of Redemption. "Blackwood's got his hounds out," he said, sipping the hot coffee Elias had brewed. "2 hard men, Riggs and Dobbs. They were in the saloon, asking about a woman. Said Blackwood was offering a reward for information on a runaway." He described Leah perfectly, from her fair hair to the simple dress she had been wearing. "Folks in town are scared of Blackwood. They will not help her, but they will not help him either. Not openly." Gus looked directly at Elias, his expression serious. "Blackwood does not like loose ends, Elias. You know his reputation. If he finds out she is here, he will come. And he will not come to talk." The old trapper's words hung in the air, heavy with warning. He finished his coffee, gave Leah a respectful nod, and prepared to leave. "You watch your back trail," he said to Elias at the door. "Both of you." His visit had confirmed their fears. The fragile peace was gone, replaced by the certainty of a coming conflict. After Gus departed, a new resolve settled over the cabin. The time for hiding was over. Elias took his axe, and Leah, bundling herself in borrowed clothes, followed him outside. Together they began to reinforce the small corral, their movements synchronized in a silent understanding. The shared labor was a language of its own. He saw her determination, the way she worked without complaint. Her hands, though unused to such rough work, steady and willing. In her eyes, behind the lingering fear, Elias saw the flicker of a will to fight back. It was a flicker he intended to nurture into a flame. The confrontation came sooner than they expected. A few days later, 2 riders appeared, their horses kicking up fresh snow as they approached the cabin. They were hard-faced men with a look of casual cruelty about them. They reined in their horses a few yards from the porch, their hands resting near their sidearms. Leah, watching from the window, felt a knot of ice form in her stomach. She recognized them from town. Riggs and Dobbs, the men Gus had warned them about. The hounds had found the trail. Elias stepped out onto the porch, a heavy rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. He stood calmly, his body relaxed but ready. "That is far enough," he said, his voice even. Riggs, a burly man with a thick neck, spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the clean snow. "We are looking for a woman, Cole," he said, his voice a low growl. "Belongs to Mr. Blackwood. Word is she ran this way. Skinny, fair-haired. Seen her?" His eyes scanned the cabin, lingering on the window where Leah was hidden. "I have not seen any women," Elias replied, his tone as cold as the winter air. "It is just me and the mountains up here. You are wasting your time." Dobbs, a wiry man with shifty eyes, gave a thin, unpleasant smile. "Blackwood pays well for folks with good eyesight. Maybe you should look again." He let his hand drop, his fingers brushing the handle of his revolver. Elias did not move, but the rifle in his arms shifted slightly, the muzzle now pointing directly at Dobbs's chest. The message was clear and silent. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the wind whispering through the pines. Riggs broke the standoff. He gave a short, sharp nod to his partner. "We will be back, Cole," he sneered. "You can count on it." They wheeled their horses around and galloped away, leaving deep tracks in the snow. Leah let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. Her heart was pounding against her ribs. But through the fear, a new feeling emerged. Gratitude. This quiet, solitary man had stood for her. He had not backed down. For the first time in a long time, she was not entirely alone. The visit from Riggs and Dobbs was a declaration of war. The question of whether Leah would stay was no longer a question at all. Her fight was now his fight. "They will be back," Elias said, his voice grim as he barred the cabin door that evening. "And they will bring more men next time." They could not run. Blackwood's reach was long, and the winter was deep. Their only choice was to make their stand here. The small cabin, once a refuge for a lonely man, was about to become a fortress. In the days that followed, they worked with a shared, urgent purpose. Elias showed Leah a narrow ravine hidden in the rocks behind the cabin, a place where they could conceal the horses if an attack came. He also pointed out a small, dry cave higher up the slope. "If things go bad," he said, "you run there. Do not wait for me." He was teaching her to survive, not just to hide. Together they reinforced the cabin, stacking firewood against the weaker walls and packing dirt into sacks to block the lower parts of the windows. As they worked, Leah spoke more about her late husband. He had believed in the law, in the promise of fairness. He had written letters to the territorial governor, detailing Blackwood's threats, but had never received a reply. "He thought honesty was a shield," she said, her voice laced with a bitter wisdom. "He thought if he just did the right thing, everything would be all right." She paused, her hands tightening on the shovel she was using. "But against men like Blackwood, you do not need a shield, you need a sword." Elias listened, his quiet presence an invitation for her to unburden her heart. He saw the fire in her, the strength forged in loss and injustice. He was no longer just protecting a woman in distress, he was standing with a partner. He took her to a clearing and handed her one of his revolvers. It was heavy in her small hands. He patiently showed her how to load it, how to aim, how to control its kick. "I hope you never have to use this," he said softly. But hope is not a plan. He was protecting an idea, that this small piece of the wild frontier belonged to them, and they had a right to defend it. Their supplies began to run low: flour, salt, coffee, and, most importantly, ammunition. A trip to the town of Redemption was unavoidable. It was a risk, but starvation was a more certain enemy than Blackwood's men. They decided to go together, leaving at dawn and riding hard. The town felt different now, charged with a quiet hostility. People watched them from doorways and windows, their faces blank but their eyes full of nervous curiosity. The news from the saloon had clearly spread. They were marked. Inside the general store, as they were gathering their goods, the door opened and cast a long shadow across the floor. Malachi Blackwood stood there. He was a tall, imposing man, dressed in a fine black coat that seemed out of place in the rustic store. His eyes, cold and gray as a winter sky, locked onto Leah. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice a silky threat. "What an unexpected pleasure. I heard you had left my lands." The word "my" was spoken with a chilling possessiveness. Leah flinched but did not look away. She felt Elias move slightly, a protective presence at her side. "They were never your lands, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, her voice trembling but clear. "And you know it." The air in the store grew thick with tension. The storekeeper froze behind his counter. A few other customers shuffled nervously towards the door. Sheriff Brody, a weary man with a drooping mustache, had just entered and stopped, his hand resting on the doorframe. He watched the scene unfold, his tired eyes missing nothing. Blackwood's smile vanished, replaced by a flash of fury. He ignored Leah and fixed his gaze on Elias. "You are making a grave mistake, Cole," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You are meddling in things that do not concern you." He held Elias's gaze for a long, threatening moment before turning sharply and striding out of the store. The confrontation was over, but the war had just been openly declared. As they paid for their supplies, Sheriff Brody gave Elias a long, searching look, a silent acknowledgement of the storm that was about to break over the valley. The attack came that same night. A moonless sky provided the perfect cover for Blackwood's men. The first warning was the shatter of glass as a bullet tore through the cabin window. Elias and Leah were ready. He had been expecting it. He shoved the heavy table against the door and returned fire with his rifle, the blast echoing like thunder in the small space. Leah, her face pale but her hands steady, moved to the supply chest. She began methodically reloading the second revolver, just as Elias had shown her. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but action kept it at bay. The siege was a terrifying ordeal of sound and shadow. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness outside, followed by the thud of lead embedding itself in the log walls. Elias moved from one window to the other, firing sparingly, making each shot count, forcing the attackers to keep their distance. He was a calm, deadly efficient presence in the chaos. He would fire, then move, while Leah, her fear channeled into focused determination, would hand him a freshly loaded firearm, her movements becoming a desperate, life-saving rhythm. After what felt like an eternity, there was a lull in the shooting. Then they heard a scraping sound near the front door. "They are trying to set a fire," Elias breathed, his voice tight. He moved to a crack in the wall, aiming his rifle. But before he could fire, another shot rang out from the darkness, from a different direction entirely. A man cried out in pain and surprise. It was not a shot from the cabin. Someone else was out there. The attackers, caught between two fires, seemed to panic, their shots becoming wild and disorganized. The unexpected aid broke the back of the assault. A few more scattered shots were fired, and then the sounds of retreating horses faded into the night. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the smell of gunpowder and the ragged sound of their own breathing. As the adrenaline receded, Elias cautiously peered outside. In the faint starlight, he saw a familiar figure emerge from the trees, a smoking rifle in his hand. It was Gus. The old trapper, sensing trouble, had decided to circle back. His loyalty had saved them. The failed attack pushed Malachi Blackwood past the point of reason. He was a man accustomed to getting his way through fear and intimidation. That a reclusive tracker and a lone woman had defied him, and won, was an insult he could not bear. This was no longer about land, it was personal. 2 days later, as the sun began to dip towards the western peaks, he rode up to the cabin himself. He was accompanied only by Dobbs. He did not come to besiege, He came for a final resolution. "Cole, get out here!" Blackwood's voice boomed across the clearing, filled with rage and arrogance. "Enough hiding behind a woman's skirts. Let us settle this like men." Elias looked at Leah, his eyes conveying a silent command. "Stay inside, no matter what happens." He checked his revolver, his movements calm and deliberate. He knew this was the only way it could end. He could not spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. He stepped out onto the porch and into the cold afternoon light, leaving Leah to watch from the window, her heart a cold stone in her chest. The two men faced each other in the snow-covered clearing. Dobbs stood off to the side, his hand hovering near his firearm, a smirk on his face. The tension was a palpable thing, a tightening cord that seemed to silence the very wind in the trees. "This ends today," Blackwood said, his voice low and guttural. Elias did not reply. His focus was absolute. On Blackwood's signal, their hands blurred towards their firearms. 2 shots exploded almost as one, the sound ripping through the mountain's stillness. In the same instant, a 3rd shot echoed from the woods. Dobbs, who had drawn his weapon to fire at Elias from the side, crumpled to the ground, a look of shock on his face. Gus had emerged from the pines, his rifle still aimed. At the same time, Blackwood staggered, a dark stain blossoming on the front of his fine coat. He had managed to fire, and a searing pain shot through Elias's left shoulder, but Elias's own shot had been true. Blackwood looked down at his chest in disbelief, then collapsed into the snow. His reign over the valley was over. Moments later, Sheriff Brody rode into the clearing. Gus had warned him. He saw the scene and knew the truth. It was self-defense. With Blackwood gone, a fragile peace settled over the valley. His empire, built on fear, crumbled without him. Elias's shoulder wound healed, leaving a scar that was a permanent reminder of their fight. Leah, with Sheriff Brody's testimony and the documents she had managed to save, formally reclaimed the deed to her late husband's land. The law, which had once been her enemy, now served justice. But the memories tied to that place were too painful. It was a chapter of her life that was closed. She sold the farm to a family new to the territory. With the money, she purchased the parcel of land that bordered Elias's property. They never spoke the word love. It seemed too small and too simple for what had been forged between them. Their bond was made of shared grief, mutual respect, and the quiet trust of 2 people who had faced death together and survived. It was something stronger than a word, a foundation built on solid rock. They belonged to this land now, and to each other. They were married in the spring, with Sheriff Brody officiating and Gus serving as their witness. The ceremony was simple, held under the budding cottonwood trees by the creek. They expanded the cabin, adding another room. They built a sturdy chicken coop and planted a garden. The rhythms of their life became a quiet melody of shared work and peaceful evenings. Gus would visit often, bringing news and delighting in the small signs of life and hope that now filled the once lonely homestead. Years passed. The sound of children's laughter eventually echoed in the clearing where gunfire once had. Their pasts were not forgotten, but the sharp edges of their grief had been worn smooth by the steady passing of days and the constant warmth of their shared life. They had built something that endured every season, a home and a family in a wild, beautiful corner of Montana. They had found their peace not in forgetting their scars, but in healing together. In a place born of solitude, they were never alone again.